Tonight, let's wrap up our series on Project 2025. I'm not saying there won't be any spin-offs or reboots in the future, but who doesn't love a good trilogy? Last week, we talked about who is behind Project 2025 and the history of political think tanks. Then we compared some of the controversial elements of 2025 with Trump's Agenda 47, so things like Medicaid, VA benefits, abortion, and so on. Tonight, let's end things how all great trilogies do, focusing on the story's bigger overarching themes. For Project 2025 and Trump's campaign, it's been about limits of presidential power. That was the cliffhanger of our last segment. I mentioned Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. It says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States, which has spurred a legal theory that basically says the president is the boss. Now, what Republicans and Trump want to figure out is how that theory becomes policy with ideas like this.
I want to close the Department of Education and move education back to the states where it belongs.
So give the states more power and the federal bureaucracy less. These ideas aren't new. This has been kind of a Republican battle cry for generations. These ideas are all over Project 2025. They want to disband the Department of Education, NOAA, and the Department of Homeland Security. They're also talking about exploring some alternatives to the Federal Reserve or defunding NPR and PBS. Now, this might sound extreme to a lot of people, but Duke professor Mac McCorkle says it may be within the president's powers to do so.
Where the executive branch is completely under the control of the president. So even though you might have an agency that Congress would call independent, they would argue that anything that is in the executive branch is completely under the control of the president.
That's why Project 2025 calls to reassign 50,000 civil servants as at-will employees who would work directly for the president and could be fired by the president. Trump has a similar idea. He calls his Schedule F. This allows the president to fire career civil servants without cause. He signed an executive order on this in 2020, but he left office before it could be enacted and says if he wins, he's going to bring it back.
First, I will immediately reissue my 2020 executive order restoring the president's authority to remove rogue bureaucrats, and I will wield that power very aggressively.
Now, this sort of thing scares a lot of people, to think of the president with the ability to wield this kind of power, but it's a bit more complicated than that. For instance, President Kennedy and his brother, they used this concept to justify their use of the DOJ to enforce civil rights violations back in the 60s. Now, in that case, most people aren't going to argue that it was a bad thing, but it did set a famous precedent of these king-like powers unrelated to war coming from the president. Now, of course, we are not king people here, are we? We do have some safeguards in our Constitution, one called the Administrative Procedure Act. This basically says when the government or the president makes a big move, has a big idea, well, they have to have a reason. They have to have a why. And it's why the Supreme Court blocked Trump's plan to deport Dreamers in the DACA ruling. Do you remember this? They cited the APA in that ruling. In the decision, Justice Roberts wrote, "Here we address only whether the administration complied with the procedural requirements in the law that insist on a reasoned explanation for its action." So here's what I'm getting at with all of this. You got one part of our Constitution that implies that the president can have absolute power. Then you have this other part that says, but only with a valid reason. And while you and I could argue about that gray area in between all day long, it will be the courts who ultimately decide. And you probably remember that this Supreme Court is the one that just ruled that the president has broad immunity from prosecution. This was a historic win for proponents of presidential power. Though I will say this trilogy of reports, unfortunately, doesn't end with a lot of clear answers because we do not know what will happen next. We don't know if Trump will win. We don't know what he would do if he did win. We don't know what challenges would be in his way or what the courts would ultimately decide. But what we do know is that as these doors continue to be pushed open, they will stay open for this president and the next one and the next one and so on, becoming nearly impossible to close. Let me know what you think. Email me at dan@WRAL.com. Tell me what is on your mind and we'll go in depth.